Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are jumping into the life of an artist whose whole story is just, well, it's a paradox. A really heartbreaking one, actually.
It is. Our mission today is to unpack the extraordinary and tragically short career of James Dean.
Right.
We really need to understand how an actor who was only 24 years old and starred in just 3 major films became this lasting symbol of youthful defiance.
And not just a symbol, but one of the most significant cultural figures of the whole 20th century. It's a deep study in just compressed impact.
Exactly.
And when you look at the numbers, the actual metrics, they just don't seem to add up. They don't reconcile with the legacy.
Not at all.
He was born in 1931, died in 1955. He was 24. His whole active career, the time he was really working in big roles, was maybe 5 years, tops.
And those 3 films, the bedrock of the entire myth, they came out in this staggered 18-month period, and mostly after he died.
Right. East of Eden was March 1955. That's the only one he actually saw released.
And then Rebel Without a Cause came out in October of 55, posthumously, and Giant wasn't until 1956. It's genuinely unprecedented to build a legacy that huge on so little finished work.
That brevity, it actually set some major records that still stand. He was the very first actor in history to get a posthumous Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. That was for East of Eden.
And then, unbelievably, he gets another one for Giant. To this day, he is the only actor to have received 2 posthumous acting nominations in that category.
It's a remarkable validation, isn't it? From his peers, from the industry, even after he was gone.
It is, and it goes beyond the Academy, the Library of Congress, the institution that preserves culturally significant works.
Yeah.
They've preserved all 3 of those films in the National Film Registry.
And even today, on a totally different level, Time magazine listed him as one of the all-time most influential fashion icons.
So you have this person who barely had time to finish his work, but he ends up defining cultural movements for decades. Let's get into how he built those 3 pillars of fame so incredibly fast.
Okay, let's start with the groundwork, because it wasn't instant. His arrival was,
Yeah.
It was a real hustle, that classic actor story, but with this frantic intensity.
Well, he drops out of the UCLA drama program in 51. He's determined to do it full-time. And the early gigs are pretty humble.
Right, like a Pepsi
A
commercial.
Pepsi commercial in 1950, yeah, his TV debut. Then he gets his first speaking role as John the Apostle in an Easter special called Hill Number 1. So, soft drinks to scripture. Quite a range.
But the real struggle was the Hollywood grind, the classic story. He was working as a parking lot attendant at CBS Studios.
Can you imagine? Parking the cars of the stars he wanted to become? But it wasn't just about the money. That struggle led him to Rogers Brackett, a radio director who became this really important mentor.
He gave him guidance, a place to stay, opened some doors for him.
And that guidance eventually led him to the place that really forged his craft, New York City. He gets there and, he needs to survive. He lands a job that just perfectly sums him up.
The game show.
Yeah, stunt tester for Beat the Clock.
And the story there is fantastic. He gets fired. Why?
Right.
Because he was performing the tasks too quickly.
He was literally too fast for the clock. It's this small detail, but it captures that manic, urgent energy that just defined his entire short life.
But New York was about more than stunts. It was about the craft. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? This is the moment that defined his entire screen persona.
He gains admission to the legendary Actors Studio to study method acting under Lee Strasberg.
Okay, so method acting is the key here. To get Dean, you have to get what the method was demanding of him.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about learning your lines. It was about digging into the deepest, most difficult parts of your own emotional history to bring this raw, visceral reality to a performance.
Strasberg's technique, it emphasized emotional recall, right? So the actor has to find a real memory of sadness or joy or rage and just channel that genuine feeling.
Exactly. And for someone like Dean, who was carrying so much unaddressed personal trauma, this wasn't just a school. It was like an explosive therapeutic outlet. Strasberg saw that volatility in him and knew how to channel it.
And we know how much this meant to him. He wrote home to his family in 52, just filled with pride. He called the Actors Studio the greatest school of the theater.
He mentions it houses legends like Marlon Brando, Julie Harris. Being accepted, especially as one of the youngest members, it just cemented his belief that this internal emotional approach was his path.
And that training paid off fast. The role that launched him back to Hollywood was a Broadway play in 1954, The Immortalist.
He played Bachir, who's described as a pandering homosexual North African houseboy.
I mean, a deeply complex, really risky role for that time.
It showed his range, for sure, but also his willingness to inhabit these characters on the margins. You know, characters defined by ambiguous or dangerous identities. It's a theme that would just dominate his career.
The performance got great reviews, and critically, it led directly to those calls from Hollywood.
And it wasn't just critics. He had this famously intense affair with his co-star, Geraldine Page, another method powerhouse. Her daughter later said Page never really got over him. She kept his pictures on her mirror for years.
Oh.
She called them artistic soulmates, that blend of emotional intensity on stage and personal entanglement off stage. That was the Dean trademark.
Which sets the stage perfectly for his Hollywood breakthrough, the first pillar of his fame, East of Eden.
East of Eden, 1955. This was his emotional breakthrough. This is what turned him from a stage actor into a screen legend. The director, Elia Kazan, was a huge part of the method movement, and he was looking for someone very specific to play the character Cal Trask.
He wanted a Brando type.
Exactly, a Brando type. And the screenwriter, Paul Osborne, suggested this relatively unknown James Dean.
What's really telling is the novelist's reaction. John Steinbeck meets Dean, and he personally dislikes him. He thinks he's moody, difficult.
But he still said Dean was perfect for the part.
That's the ultimate endorsement of his authenticity, isn't it? He didn't have to charm the creator, he just had to embody the character's difficult truth.
Right. And because Kazan embraced the method, he gave Dean this massive amount of freedom to improvise, and those moments, they fundamentally changed cinematic acting.
Okay, let's unpack that unscripted genius. Because this is the moment American cinema really shifts away from that formal classical style. You know, the style of actors like Raymond Massey, who played his father.
Okay, so the sources point to three incredible examples. First, there's his spontaneous dance in the bean field. It's just Cal's restless, pent-up energy bursting out in this moment of pure, unbridled movement.
And then there's the train scene. After he finds his mother, he's on top of a boxcar, and he just retreats into this deeply vulnerable, almost fetal-like posture.
These weren't just random additions. They were physical expressions of a character who just couldn't contain his inner turmoil. It gave you a window into his psyche that words just couldn't.
But the most famous one, the most dramatic example, is the scene where his father, Adam Trask, rejects his gift of $5,000.
Right. The script, the traditional script, called for Cal to just be sad, to turn and run away from his father in defeat.
But Dean didn't do that.
No. Tapping into that method core, he didn't run. He lunged forward. He grabs Raymond Massey in this full, desperate, gut-wrenching embrace, burying his face in his chest and just crying out.
And Massey was a classical actor. He was not prepared for that.
Not at all. The sources confirm he was genuinely shocked by this unscripted physical attack of emotion. And Kazan, he kept the whole raw exchange in the film.
It's the vulnerability, but it's combined with the sort of the physical violence of that need. It makes the scene electric. And that character, Cal Trask, the misunderstood outcast who's desperate for his father's approval, it just hit an immediate chord.
The excitement was huge, even before the film was released. Hedda Hopper, the gossip columnist, wrote, "I can't remember when any screen newcomer generated as much excitement as did James Dean in his first picture."
It was instant legend building.
And we have to stress this again. East of Eden was the only film starring Dean that was released while he was still alive. The rest of the myth was built after he was gone.
Which brings us to the second pillar, Rebel Without a Cause.
Right. If East of Eden showed his internal genius, Rebel created the external image, the iconography that defined a generation.
He played Jim Stark, the quintessential disillusioned teenager. And what's so fascinating is the immediate sociocultural resonance. The film was instantly seen as this accurate representation of teenage angst.
It hit so hard with mid-50s youth who felt completely misunderstood by their parents, by their peers, by everyone.
This film didn't just entertain people, it gave them a cultural template for what it meant to be young. That mix of vulnerability, confusion, and raw defiance. The red jacket, the t-shirt, it became cinematic shorthand for being a teenager.
But Dean himself was very aware of the danger of being typecast after two roles like that.
He didn't want to be the tortured teenager forever.
No, which is why he took on the third and final role, jet rink in Giant.
A sprawling, epic role.
A huge artistic challenge. He had to play this Texan ranch hand who finds oil and gets rich over decades. It forced him to portray growth, decay, transformation. It demanded a complexity that was miles away from the rage of Jim Stark.
It really shows his commitment to the craft, not just to being a star. And he committed physically, too. To play the older jet rink, he dyed his hair gray and shaved some of it to create a receding hairline.
He was pushing himself to prove he was an actor, not just a mood. And this film gave us his tragically perfect yet incomplete final moment on screen.
The Last Supper scene.
Yeah, a drunken banquet speech by an older jet rink. And Dean, driven by his method dedication, wanted to be actually drunk for the scene, to capture that genuine slurring deterioration.
But it kind of backfired, didn't it? He ended up mumbling so much the audio was unusable.
Exactly. The director, George Stevens, realized the whole scene had to be overdubbed. And the irony is just, it's haunting. The voice of this eternal rebel in his final performance had to be replaced by another actor, Nick Adams, because Dean died before they could fix it in post-production.
So the commitment was there, but the final product was unfinished.
It's just a perfect, tragic encapsulation of his entire career. Brilliance, total commitment, and then sudden, unfinished silence.
Okay, so before we get to the end of the story, we have to look at the short, tumultuous life that supplied all that emotional intensity for his performances.
Right. If the three films were the pillars of his fame, then his personal life, steeped in trauma and conflicting identities, was the explosive foundation. It explains so much about that energy he had on screen.
He was born in Marion, Indiana, only child. His family moved to Santa Monica, California when he was young, and he had this incredibly close bond with his mother, Mildred.
Biographers later described her as the only person capable of understanding him.
And that foundational relationship was just brutally cut short. When he was 9, his mother died suddenly of uterine cancer.
A devastating, life-altering trauma. And his father, who seems to have been unable to cope, sent Dean back to Indiana to live with his Quaker aunt and uncle on their farm.
That transition alone must have been traumatic. From sunny California and this close maternal bond to a strict, rural Quaker upbringing in the Midwest right after losing his mother.
It's that sudden displacement, that emotional void, that yearning for a lost connection. That is precisely what you see him channeling into Cal Trask in East of Eden.
And yet, despite that loss, he did really well in Fairmount. He was a popular student, great at sports, drama, public speaking.
But during this formative time, a very influential and controversial figure entered his life.
The local Methodist pastor, Reverend James DeWeerd.
Yes. Dean sought him out for friendship and guidance, and DeWeerd became this major mentor figure, steering his interest toward bullfighting, car racing, and significantly theater.
But the sources here, they get into much darker, more complex territory.
They do. There are reports of an intimate relationship between Dean and the pastor that lasted for years, starting when Dean was a late teenager.
And even more seriously, there are reports and biographies that raise allegations of sexual abuse. Some sources say Dean confided in Elizabeth Taylor that he'd been abused by a minister about 2 years after his mother's death.
Other reports suggest the abuse was by DeWeerd himself, either when Dean was a child or a late teen. And it's impossible to look at his adult behavior without the context of these alleged traumas. They really help shape the complexity and the ambiguity of his adult identity.
That constant tension between his private reality and his public persona, it was largely driven by his complicated sexuality and the insane pressure of the 1950s studio system.
Let's look at the close relationships that really tested those boundaries. Screenwriter William Bast was his college roommate, and they later lived together in New York. The Dean family always said Bast was his closest friend for the last 5 years of his life.
For decades, the nature of their relationship was really obscured. But Bast, in his 2006 biography, finally clarified it. He confirmed that he and Dean had been lovers one night.
And that revelation confirmed Dean was exploring his identity far outside the strict heterosexual norms that Hollywood was demanding.
And we know exactly why that was suppressed. Warner Brothers was heavily invested in protecting the image of its young male stars. They framed Dean as an eligible bachelor, often grouping him with guys like Rock Hudson and Tab Hunter.
A very carefully curated heterosexual image for the masses. They actively discouraged any relationship that didn't fit that marketing template.
But that studio narrative just collided head-on with his most famous romance, the one with the Italian actress Pier Angeli.
Their connection was immediate and incredibly intense. She later described their secret meetings on the California coast as feeling like Romeo and Juliet.
He was clearly deeply invested. He said, everything about Pier is beautiful, especially her soul.
But despite that connection, there were these huge forces working against them. Angeli's Catholic mother hated that Dean wasn't Catholic and that he dressed so casually.
And Warner Bros. Was strongly discouraging marriage for their rising star.
And perhaps most critically, Dean himself told Angeli he didn't want to get married, which probably reflects his own deep emotional conflicts and commitment issues.
That emotional block led directly to the breakup. Angeli shocked everyone by suddenly announcing her engagement to the singer Vic Damone.
The fallout became Hollywood legend. Columnists reported that Dean watched her wedding from across the road on his motorcycle, even gunning the engine during the ceremony.
A claim he denied, by the way. He called it dumb. But the image stuck. It just fueled that narrative of the heartbroken rebel.
But the internal truth is stark. After he died, among his personal effects, they found a little marriage pamphlet with Pier penciled in where the bride's name should be.
And the tragedy of that relationship just continued. Angeli later said Dean was the true love of her life. She died from a barbiturate overdose at age 39.
It just became another profound layer of the myth. So you connect the dots from Bass to Angeli, filter it all through the studio system, and you arrive at this core ambiguity about his sexuality. He didn't fit into any neat box.
And the most famous quote attributed to him sums it up perfectly. No, I am not a homosexual, but I'm also not going to go through life with one hand tied behind my back.
That statement just encapsulates his exploratory spirit. But biographers and friends have spent decades trying to interpret it, which has resulted in all these conflicting theories.
So let's go through some of the theories from the sources, just reporting them impartially. First, you have the portrayed theory.
Right. The journalist Joe Hyams suggested Dean was pragmatic, that he would have sex with men if it advanced his career, particularly regarding his mentor, Rogers Brackett.
Brackett himself called their bond somewhat incestuous.
On the other hand, a friend, John Gilmore, claimed he and Dean experimented with gay sex in New York, and he later concluded that Dean was more gay than bisexual.
But the most definitive statement, which still seems to get ignored, came from his director on Rebel, Nicholas Ray.
Ray stated it on the record. He said, James Dean was not straight, he was not gay, he was bisexual. That seems to confuse people, or they just ignore the facts.
But given the intense stigma of the 1950s, how much can we really trust any of these public statements?
That's the essential question. The atmosphere demanded secrecy. You have Martin Landau, a close friend from the actor studio, who completely contradicted that narrative. He said they only talked about girls.
So maybe Dean just carefully compartmentalized his life.
It seems like it. And then you have Elizabeth Taylor, his co-star in Giant. She once referred to him as gay, but then she clarified it later. She said, he hadn't made up his mind. He and I, we twinkled.
What's so fascinating is how his refusal to be contained by a label resulted in a legacy where even those closest to him held conflicting views. He was an emotional chameleon on and off screen.
The ultimate method performance, in a way. The vulnerability was real, but the identity was fluid, complex, and fiercely private.
And that incredibly fast-paced personal life was matched by an equally fast-paced, all-consuming hobby, auto racing. A passion that ultimately fueled his legend and his fate.
Let's transition to that final chapter too fast. His racing passion started almost right after he finished filming East of Eden. And he didn't just dabble, he went into it professionally with that same obsessive intensity he had for acting.
He had serious machines. A Triumph Tiger motorcycle and a Porsche 356 Super Speedster. And he was good at it.
He was very good. In March 1955, at the Palm Springs Road Races, he finished first in the novice class and second in the main event. A month later at Bakersfield, he finished first in his class again.
But the studio put a stop to it. Warner Brothers barred him from racing during the production of Giant. They were terrified of losing their new star.
That ban lasted until he wrapped his final scenes, and as soon as he was done, he immediately traded in his Speedster for a brand new, cutting-edge machine, a 1955 Porsche 550 Spyder. This was a dangerous, sophisticated racing car.
And he gave it that now infamous nickname, Little Bastard.
He was scheduled to race in Salinas on October 1st. On September 30th, the day before, he decided to drive the car all the way from L.A. to Salinas himself to break in the engine.
And he wasn't alone. His German mechanic, Rolf Wutherich, was in the passenger seat. Following behind in a station wagon were a stunt coordinator and photographer.
The day was already marked by speed. At 3:30 that afternoon, Dean got a speeding ticket.
The fatal crash happened around 5:45 p.m. near a small town called Cholum, Dean was driving westbound on U.S. Route 466.
And a 1950 Ford Tudor, driven by a 23-year-old student named Donald Turnipseed, was traveling east and made a critical mistake. He tried to make a left turn directly in front of the oncoming Porsche.
And Dean was going way too fast to react.
He slammed directly into the passenger side of the Ford. The impact was catastrophic for the little spider. Wutherich, the mechanic, was thrown clear and survived with serious injuries.
But Dean was trapped in the wreckage. He sustained numerous fatal injuries, including a broken neck. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital at 6:20 p.m.
The news spread like wildfire. It was a massive international event. His funeral in Indiana drew 600 mourners inside and 2,400 hysterical fans outside. The coffin had to remain closed.
And what's really important to this story is that the inquest placed the fault for the accident entirely on Dean, citing excessive speed. It just cemented the narrative. He lived fast, and he died fast.
So the man was gone, but the legend was instantly born, fueled by those two films waiting for release. It was Humphrey Bogart who famously said, "Dean died at just the right time. He left behind a legend. If he had lived, he'd never have been able to live up to his publicity."
That is exceptionally harsh, but it speaks right to the paradox we started with. His appeal comes from this perfect storm, right? The public's need for a champion for the disenfranchised young, plus that intense androgynous air he projected.
Joe Hyams called him one of the rare stars of that era, like Rock Hudson or Montgomery Clift, whom both men and women find sexy. That universal appeal and the sense of unfulfilled potential just cemented him as this mythological figure.
And the power of that myth is still huge. His state still earns about $5 million a year. But any attempt to exploit or revive that image has met with this swift, furious backlash.
Yeah, that announcement a few years ago about creating a CGI version of him for a film called Finding Jack. It was met with widespread condemnation and was eventually shelved. It proves the legend is untouchable, preserved in amber by his early death.
Beyond the money, his influence on actors is staggering. Martin Sheen said Dean transcended cinema acting. It was no longer acting. It was human behavior.
Johnny Depp and Nicolas Cage both explicitly cited Dean as the reason they wanted to become actors. Cage said nothing affected him. No rock song, no classical music the way Dean did in East of Eden.
Leonardo DiCaprio's reflection is really telling. He said he was incredibly moved by Jimmy Dean, his vulnerability, his confusion about his entire history, his identity, his desperation to be loved. That performance just broke my heart.
It's that raw, emotionally exposed core. That's exactly what the method delivered.
Let's turn to the other major part of his legacy, his style, and his just singular influence on music and youth culture.
We mentioned the fashion accolades, but the why is so important. His signature look jeans, a white t-shirt, a red windbreaker, or a motorcycle jacket, it became the panoply of adolescence.
In the super conservative 1950s, this wasn't just casual clothing. It was a statement. A powerful expression of resistance against adult conventions, against suits and ties.
It transformed working-class clothes into a uniform of defiance, and it became a universal wardrobe staple.
But the influence goes deeper. It served as the visual and emotional template for the biggest cultural shift of the 20th century, the birth of rock and roll.
Commentators have called him the first rock star, a harbinger of youth identity politics.
His persona, especially Jim Stark in Rebel, was the perfect brooding template for the music revolution that was just starting to bubble up. It influenced guys like Elvis Presley, Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent.
Elvis himself intensely studied Dean and Brando. He said in an interview, "We're sullen, we're brooding, we're something of a menace. I know you can't be sexy if you smile. You can't be a rebel if you grin." He distilled Dean's entire attitude into the essential rock star persona.
Rock historian Grail Marcus called Dean and Presley twin symbols of tribal teenage identity. They created this whole visual and emotional language for young people.
Absolutely. Bob Dylan cited Dean as a key influence. He consciously copied Dean's look on album covers like the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. His biographer called him James Dean with a guitar.
David Bowie, too. And his image just keeps popping up. The Beach Boys, the Eagles, all the way to contemporary artists like Lana Del Rey and Taylor Swift. The look is eternal shorthand for high stakes, troubled romance, and effortless cool.
He provided the blueprint for cool that never needed an update. The defiant attitude, the inner turmoil, the style, it was all wrapped up in this package that, because he died so young, never had a chance to fade or age or disappoint.
He's perpetually young, perpetually misunderstood, and perpetually relevant.
And that brings us right back to the core paradox. A life defined by extreme brevity, 24 years, and minimal output, 3 major films, resulted in a cultural shift so seismic it was irreversible. He's cemented not just as a star, but as a myth.
A myth whose unfulfilled potential just fuels his eternal relevance.
The ultimate method actor. He died as he lived, intensely, too fast, leaving behind an unfinished masterpiece.
Bogart suggested Dean died at just the right time to preserve his legend. So given the instant visceral controversy around the attempt to use his CGI likeness 60 years later, the protective outrage it inspired, does this intense frustration with exploiting his image maybe prove Bogart was right? Was the legend only safe because the man never had the chance to live up to it and thus never had the chance to disappoint us? That's something for you to mull over.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.